刚谈到了美国跟中国大陆之间的关系，尤其是现在开始从亚洲国家是怎么样来看的？我们继续来跟 Professor Freiberg 做访问。Beijing summit between President Xi Jinping and President Obama. This summit, it seems from other countries, seeing the summit being held in Beijing and what's happening last year in California, seem to be two great powers deciding for the rest of the world. That is a G2 image happening. Do you think that this summit had created that kind of image, and how can the U.S. Keep the promise, especially the security promise, to its Asian allies?
Well, I think China, although it's in the past said that it resisted the idea of a G2 and didn't want a G2, and still says that it doesn't believe in a G2.
Try to avoid the responsibility.
Yes, exactly. And also this idea of the democratization of international relations and so on. So they're opposed to it in theory, but I think in practice, this is what they want, a relationship in which they are the other most important country in the world and the most important relationship that the United States has. So sometimes the optics or the appearance of that kind of cooperation are unavoidable. I think there are ways in which American leaders can offset that when they come to Asia, making sure that they stop first in the capitals of friendly democratic countries
Tokyo,
and so on.
for instance.
Yes, Tokyo is always a good first stop. So some of this has to do with appearances rather than concrete reality. And I think if you look at the recent meeting in Beijing, what it tells you is that both the U.S. and the Chinese side have a desire and an interest to create at least the appearance of improved relations and the pursuit of cooperation. And it's not insincere. But if you look more carefully at what, in fact, they agreed to, there's less there than meets the eye. I think the underlying dynamic is still increasingly competitive, but both sides want to try to keep that under control. They don't want this to appear to be a new Cold War. They don't want the relationship to unravel. So they're looking for ways to convey that, and by smiling and by signing some agreements and so on, they're trying to do that. But it doesn't change the underlying reality.
You just bring up Japan. I would like to talk a little bit about Japan.
Yes.
Japan is the most important ally for the U.S. in Asia.
Yes.
But how do you see, since Prime Minister Abe getting power, some people think that Prime Minister Abe is the key source for the tension between China and Japan. That would bring the U.S. into this conflict. Do you agree with that?
I really don't. I think the tension between China and Japan goes back well before Prime Minister Abe. There may be statements that he's made or things that people in his administration have said or done that the Chinese then point to as causing the tension. But that's not really the underlying source of the tension. Japan is the most important American ally in the United States. And I think overall what the Abe administration has been trying to do makes sense from the point of view of Japan's national interests and is a good thing for the United States. And by that I mean increasing spending on Japan's defense capabilities, taking steps to try to revitalize the Japanese economy, presenting Japan as a more normal country capable of defending itself and acting on the international stage.
Let me interrupt.
Yes.
That is even including reinterpretation of the Constitution or the new interpretation on the history after post.
There, I think, the issues of history, I think, are very problematic for the United States and for others in the region. And I think this is an American's opinion, and of course the Japanese people and political leaders decide these questions for themselves. But the reopening of the history issues is, in my view, unhelpful to Japan and simply serves to isolate Japan. It, I think, serves the interests of China because it arouses unhappy memories and anger towards Japan, not only in China, but in other countries in the region. The reasons for doing that, for the Japanese leaders emphasizing and talking about history, are complex and have to do in part with their domestic political calculations. But there's no doubt from a strategic and a diplomatic point of view that it would be better if they simply left these issues aside, or better yet, found a way convincingly to present to other countries, particularly other democratic countries, their genuine regret over what happened during the war. I think China is special when it comes to the history issue, because the Chinese leadership, and China, of course, is not a democratic country, has an interest in maintaining the history issue and keeping it alive as a stick with which to beat Japan and to keep Japan down. Other countries in the region, I think, are different. Other democracies are different. I don't think Japan can ever satisfy China on the history issues, but it ought to be looking for ways to put this question aside with friendly democratic countries.
In regarding the interpretation of the Constitution to have a collective security, a collective self-defense.
Yes.
Do you think the U.S. government is supporting that idea and to increase Japan's defense capability?
Yes. I think the official position of the United States is that revision of the Constitution is the right and responsibility of the Japanese people and their political representatives. But I don't think most American leaders and strategic thinkers see any problem in the revision of the Constitution in the ways that have been discussed. And in fact, it seems like a sensible thing to do. Japan is self-constrained in its ability to participate in collective defense by the terms of, or the interpretation of Article 9 of the Constitution in ways that would prevent it legally from participating in conflict if it didn't directly involve attacks on Japanese territory. And that makes the alliance with the United States a very unequal and peculiar alliance. So I think to the extent that revision of the Constitution allows Japan to be a more normal ally, that's a good thing.
You mentioned that this history explanation will antagonize some country outside of China. I'm having in mind is South Korea.
Yes.
And South Korea is also a U.S. ally.
Right.
But recently, China have been heat up its relations with South Korea by signing free trade agreement, by visiting, before North Korea visit, Xi Jinping would visit South Korea.
Right.
Are you sensing that the South Korea is drifting apart from the U.S., especially its relations with Japan? It's become very hard to manage.
Well, there are two separate but very closely related issues there. One is the relationship between Japan and South Korea, and the other is the relationship between South Korea and China. The deterioration in relations between Japan and South Korea is very unfortunate, and it's also strategically problematic for the United States. It's something that I think China seeks to promote as a way of driving a wedge into the structure of American alliances. So it's very unfortunate, and it's one of the most serious costs for Japan of its handling of the history issue has been the deterioration of relations with Korea. At the same time, there continues to be a strong interest, I think, in both Japan and South Korea, certainly on the part of their militaries and their diplomatic corps, to improve relations and to work more closely. I think there's a recognition that the two, as fellow democratic countries and fellow allies of the United States, have some very strong common interests and need to cooperate. But the political turmoil over the history issue has made that very difficult. As far as the relationship between South Korea and China, China is definitely trying and has been trying to woo South Korea to some extent to draw it away from its relationship with the United States. It's done that over the last 10 or 15 years, in part by presenting itself as the country that could solve the nuclear issue, which it hasn't really done. It's done it in part also by extending the free trade agreements that you mentioned. China is now the most important trade and investment partner for South Korea, as for other countries in the region. At the same time, I think if you look certainly at public opinion polls in South Korea, there's a growing concern over the implications for Korea in the long run of the growth of Chinese power, and a recognition that South Korea, democratic South Korea, can't thrive in a region that's dominated by China. And for that reason, it's necessary to maintain close relations with the United States, and also, I think, in the long run, to improve relations with Japan. But there's no doubt that China is trying to work on Korea and trying to increase its charm and its favorability in the eyes of people in South Korea. But they've been doing that for a while with mixed results.
In your book, you mentioned Taiwan as a quasi-alliance country. And you propose there should be more cooperation between Taiwan and the United States. What do you have in mind? Do you think that the current security and military relations should be upgraded to a certain degree?
I don't know if they have to be upgraded in a formal sense, but there are things that have been done in the past and are continuing to be done, perhaps could be done more, by way of dialogue and exchange and cooperation between the military establishments of the two countries that would make sense in from a strategic point of view, and that ought to continue. The United States has in the past and continues to have a commitment under the Taiwan Relations Act to provide Taiwan with some arms and equipment in order to defend itself. And I think that is important, both in a practical sense, to the extent that it provides Taiwan with usable military capabilities to deter aggression, but it's even more important, I think, in the symbolic political sense, because our willingness to do that, even in the face of inevitable Chinese objections, is a strong signal of our continuing commitment to Taiwan. So I believe it's very important for the United States to maintain that relationship and periodically to stand up to Chinese pressure and to go through with transactions that strengthen Taiwan's military capabilities.
There is opposition to that. Of course, you are aware that some people are afraid that might antagonize China. And that is something that Taiwan is very worried, that there's a abandonment of Taiwan coming out from the U.S. That's one thing. But I'm more worried about the second thing, meaning that some people argue Taiwan become too close with China in the recent days, that they are afraid that if by selling Taiwan more advanced weapons, this might end up in the wrong hand.
Right.
How do you think about those two arguments?
Yes. There's certainly concern, and there has been for a decade and more, on the part of some people in the United States about providing advanced technology to Taiwan for the reason that you mentioned. I think there are people in the United States who believe that Taiwan isn't really serious about defending itself and has not been spending enough, hasn't been buying the right kinds of military systems, and simply relies on the United States to continue to protect it by implying at least that it would come to Taiwan's aid in the event of a conflict with China. So there is a school of thought that holds that Taiwan hasn't been doing enough. Some people believe that in the long run, Taiwan must inevitably fall under the control of the mainland, and that perhaps it would be better for the U.S.-China relationship if that were to happen. I don't agree with that. I think a lot of Americans don't agree with that. I believe that, in fact, it's very important, as I said, for the United States to continue to reassert its commitment to Taiwan and to a peaceful resolution of the differences between the two. I think there's been perhaps an artificial sense on the part of some people in the U.S. that the relationship between Taiwan and China is now on a permanent upward trajectory, that the period of instability going back about 10 years ended with the election of President Ma, and that perhaps the issue no longer was one of concern. I don't think that that's necessarily true, and it would seem to me that the recent elections on Taiwan and the possibility that there might be a change in governing party in 2016 could reopen the period of tensions between Taiwan and the mainland, and that could involve the United States as well. So clearly this issue is not resolved. And the question in my mind would be whether, in fact, we're in for a period of renewed crises of the sort that we saw at around the turn of the century and of increased Chinese pressure on Taiwan to come to some settlement that the mainland would find acceptable. So I'm rather concerned. I think we may be heading into a period of renewed crises in which the United States will have to take a strong stand.
In the Asia security overall, you mentioned that there's going to be more emphasis on the rebalancing side. Do you think it's possible for the Asian country, especially those countries who had close security arrangement with the United States, Japan, Australia, for instance, can there be an Asia NATO forming, maybe starting with not many countries, like in Europe NATO, but it's possible for collective security to be formed?
I don't think an Asian NATO is in the offing. In other words, a formal arrangement in which countries in the region would have a collective security understanding. And I don't think anyone in the U.S. is pushing that, partly because there's a feeling that other countries would feel uncomfortable. U.S. allies wouldn't want to be put into that position, and obviously also that China would object. But that said, I think there's also a recognition that it's in the interests of the United States not only to strengthen its bilateral relations with its traditional allies and security partners, but to encourage them to cooperate more closely with one another.
Right.
So what we might get is a kind of virtual alliance or network of networks in which the United States cooperates with Japan, and Japan cooperates with India, and the United States cooperates with Australia, and Australia cooperates with Japan and India. Japan cooperates with Taiwan, and so on. It's not a formal alliance, but it's a thickening of ties among countries that share an interest in maintaining a balance of power, even as China grows stronger. And the fact that Japan has now lifted the formal restraints on its ability to export weapons means that it is going to play a major role in helping countries in the region strengthen their capabilities. The Philippines is looking to improve its strategic cooperation with the United States and may purchase some military systems from Japan and others. Vietnam potentially could become more involved. So I think it's not a NATO, it's not a formal alliance, but it's a mechanism that involves cooperation among a number of independent states that share a common interest in stability.
Okay, we'll talk about the U.S. domestic politics and its foreign policy later. 我们等一下第三节回来，我们继续来谈美国国内政治跟它的中国政策。